Welcome, everyone. I'm excited to introduce our first panel for the day. This panel actually piggybacks really well off of Charles's talk. We're going to be discussing how we can ensure environmental health research and funding leads to environmental justice. Some of the things we're going to talk about are actually that our presenters are going to talk about were some of the programs that Charles mentioned. And we have two really great people with us today. First, our first speaker is going to be Dr. Ahimsa Porter Sumchai. Dr. Sumchai is the founder, medical director, and principal investigator of the Hunters Point Community Biomonitoring Program. Dr. Sumchai's leadership in the environmental health and justice movement began in 1992, after signing the death certificate of her father. This is a story that I think many folks in EJ communities will sound very familiar to. Her father, George Donald Porter, was a career longshore walking boss and shipping clerk who died prematurely from pulmonary asbestosis. It's something that, we hear a lot about, environmental exposures, not just in the workplace, but also in our communities. And this has been the basis for a lot of what I believe has driven Dr. Sumchai to her current work. She graduated from the University of California at San Francisco School of Medicine. She was a Stanford University Department of Surgery postdoc fellow, and has over her career been involved in a number of community-based task forces, research initiatives, and biomonitoring projects focused on toxics and radiological impacts from power plants, advocating for policies to clean up toxic sites and prevent pollution in EJ communities. And she's going to talk to us today about some of the work that she's done and some of the role that researchers have working in environmental justice. Our other speaker today is Priya Mulgaonkar. She works at the intersection of policy, planning, and organizing to advocate for environmental and climate justice solutions that center frontline communities. She's currently the senior policy and field manager at the Green New Deal Network, where she supports policy research and capacity building for state and federal climate advocacy campaigns. She previously worked at Hester Street, managing projects for community-partnered planning, design, research, and communications, as well as the New York City Environmental Justice Alliance, where she led research, advocacy, and organizing for multiple campaigns for climate justice and community resiliency. She earned her master's in urban planning from Hunter College and a BA from NYU. The way our panel is going to work today is that we're going to have each of our panelists do about a 10 or 15-minute presentation about their work. And then we're going to have opportunity for question and answer. So if you do have questions that you're thinking about during the presentations, feel free to drop them in the chat. And I'll be able to raise those up after the presentations. Our first speaker, Dr. Sumchai, do you want to go ahead first? And do you also need me to share the map that you sent me?
Yes. Let me just start by thanking you for the honor and the opportunity of being with you this morning. And I would also like to commend Mr. Lee on the presentation that very much is going to boost, many of my comments. There are a couple of things with regard to my biography that I do think are relevant that I just want to mention quickly. One is that I served as a physician specialist for the San Francisco Department of Public Health, and in 1997, I served as the attending physician for what was then called the Persian Gulf Agent Orange Ionizing Radiation Registry of the Palo Alto Veterans Administration. The Veterans Administration Hospital has the nation's largest toxic registry, and as part of my responsibilities, I interviewed some of the atomic vets who had survived the World War II, post-World War II Operation Crossroads detonations in the South Pacific. And additionally, on a community level, I serve voluntarily as the health and environmental science editor of the SF Bayview newspaper, and I chaired the radiological subcommittee of the Hunters Point Shipyard Restoration Advisory Board, a system of 3 federal Superfund sites that we currently are studying. And then I'm also an expert witness for the 9,000 plaintiff Hunters Point community lawsuit. So that, I think, helps to, explain why I'm here. The Hunters Point Biomonitoring Program, when it launched in January of 2019, it was our second effort to establish a human biomonitoring program and a toxic registry in a community that health impacts had already identified as being at high risk of environmental exposure and expressions of disease. In January of 2019, we were able to launch because if you believe in the law of attraction, in 2018, a radioactive object had been found in a residential development on land that had been transferred to the city and county of San Francisco on a federal Superfund site. The radioactive object contained radium, and at that discovery, a group of us who had formed the nucleus of the 2010 effort to get funding for community exposure research got together and decided that we were going to go forward with it again. And my challenge was, having worked at the VA and tested Persian Gulf veterans for depleted uranium, I knew that it could be done. The issue is, how are we going to do it on a community level, and how are we going to build a kind of trust that is essential for collecting a biological specimen. And I happen to have a little talk with a friend who's a clinical nutritionist, as I am, and she was saying that she had found this kit and that she was using it to test people via a urinary screening for nutrient elements. And she was concerned about things like calcium, magnesium, and iron. And she said, and by the way, it also detects toxic elements. And when I looked at the suite of chemicals that this simple little kit analyzes, and in 10 days average returns a result, it fit very closely with the chemicals of concern the EPA and the Navy document to be present in shipyard soils. And so there was this little kit that could be collected at the site of exposure and mailed by a FedEx envelope, and then get a return result. And it gives you a reliable screening that again needs corroboration, but still it was a start for us. And right out the gate, we were detecting things from the first screening of a man with laryngeal cancer who had been exposed to visible dust at work, who had elevated levels of aluminum in his urine, and was operating a forklift and shoveling aluminum cans, to having a woman come in an acute asthma attack, who lives on the hilltop adjacent to a Superfund site where deep soil excavations were being conducted. And when we screened her urine, we effectively found multiple elements known to be present in the dirt at this federal Superfund site, in concentrations exceeding what is allowable for the reference range. We also had some interesting screenings with a family of 4 who all had similar elements of manganese and vanadium. And when we did our initial screenings, we were seeing these 2 elements, manganese and vanadium, showing up very, very frequently. We still are seeing them about 80% of the time. And manganese and vanadium are detected in shipyard soils about 100% of the time in about 3,000 samplings. By year 2, we were seeing some patterns of distribution in where the chemicals were being detected above reference range. And I want to emphasize that unlike the California Biomonitoring Program and the CDC Biomonitoring Program that graph detections as low as the 25th percentile of the population, we are doing people and other researchers and legal interests a favor by mapping detections that exceed what is allowable, for a reference population. And in doing that, we were starting to see clusters when we had enough people who had radioactive biomarkers detected, then we started to see patterns of distribution. And Denise, this would be a really good time to show that slide. What I'm showing you is a map. This is a map that was created by a Navy contractor, Tetra Tech. It is called the Base-Wide Radiological Impaction Map. It appears in an important Navy document, and it's a little busy, but all you have to understand is that anything in green, including the hatched areas, is radiologically impacted. This is the Hunters Point Shipyard, a federal Superfund site. The entire base was placed on the national priority list in 1989, and it has spawned what I call little baby Superfund sites. The E2 area is an industrial landfill that is separately designated a federal Superfund site, and then south of E2, there is a body of water called the South Basin, and it extends via a channel west into the community within 3 blocks of the main street in this community, 3rd Street. Yosemite Slough extends, and it too is a federal Superfund site. The significance of the landfill at E2 and the Yosemite Slough channel is that the residents and workers who we have tested who have uranium, cesium, gadolinium, rubidium, thallium, strontium, cobalt, and plutonium in their urine specimens in concentrations exceeding what we will allow for these toxic elements. And I want to point out, I'm not saying what is normal. It is not normal to have any of these toxic elements. These elements play no role in human physiology, and we allow them because we have exposed populations. When you see a population of people who have these detections and concentrations that are astronomically high. We have a woman who works here on the shoreline who had uranium detected in concentration 17 times higher than allowable. But the simple message here, without understanding the specific geography of the area, but only looking visually at what is displayed in this geospatial mapping, is that the people who have these radioactive biomarkers in their urine are living or working along the western fence line, adjacent to the E2 landfill, and at the main entry, the corridor of entry to the base and the campus of the Naval Radiological Defense Laboratories. So this was sort of the second stage of our research, where we started to conduct the geospatial mapping. We have other maps. I don't have enough time. I will just say that we also mapped people who had been diagnosed with radiogenic cancers, the Atomic Bomb Registry, the VA hospital, the World Trade Center health program identify as being linked to exposure to ionizing radiation and carcinogenic chemicals. And those cancers, which include brain, thyroid, breast, lung, prostate, leukemias, lymphomas. There are also some canine cancers, sarcomas, that are linked to radiation exposure. But the overlay of people who have these cancers matches what we are seeing in the clusters of people who have radioactive biomarkers. And the mapping alone offers evidence of cause and effect. Just that overlap of the map between the people who have radioactive biomarkers in their urine in high concentrations and the people who have been diagnosed with cancers that we all accept as being induced by a radiation exposure. So I know that I need to be finishing up, and we could go back to the live screen. But I will say that what has happened in the last couple of years is that we have had another doctor corroborate some of my findings with the screening. Dr. James Dahlgren is a world-renowned environmental toxicologist. He was an expert witness in the Aaron Brockovich case, and he's conducted a 24-hour urine screening capable of detecting products of nuclear fission, and he's detected radioisotopes of uranium, plutonium, and potassium, which are very, very specific, for the site. We've also used environmental testing, including videography. We have some citizen scientists, residents who live at the fence line who flew a surveillance drone over the fence to monitor the Navy's excavations of the landfill. We've done handheld Geiger counter readings. We've done some soil testing, and we are also very fortunate to be working in collaboration with other community organizations who administer a system of particulate sensing air monitors that are hooked up to what is called the IVAN network. It's a network that allows people to, via a digital device, report common environmental violations and have a regulator respond to them. And now with the EPA's emphasis on enforcement, we're starting to get things done. So in closure, I was asked to address how environmental funding impacts environmental justice and litigation. And I would say that work that is based in community exposure science that incorporates citizen scientists among people who are affected and invested. These types of models help to establish the type of cause and effect relationships that are necessary to drive litigation. I will also say, however, that many of these low-income, overburdened communities really don't have the resources to take on the United States Navy or government interests or powerful corporate entities. And my own experience is that you can get a heck of a lot done through administrative channels, including complaints. It is amazing, what you can do with an administrative complaint. And I do urge people to the maximum use the complaint system, the appeal system, and administrative lines of responsibility in addressing these issues, and then use that archive of information that you've accrued along with other environmental science and public health information to push for a litigation recovery and the establishment of toxic registries. When you've got a large population of people who've been exposed, then you need to be able to handle them in a medical and a social and an economic model, and toxic registries offer us that model.
Thank you. That was a really great presentation that really dug into some of what researchers are looking at when we're looking at community biomonitoring projects. I think it's a really great example. Priya is going to talk to us about some of the federal funds that have recently become available and how those are moving through states and what can be available for particularly EJ communities. And then I'm hoping after that we'll have some time for discussion on how we can bring this great example of these biomonitoring projects and community science together with some of the federal funds that are flowing to states. So Priya, I think you would like me to screen share, correct? Awesome. So I'm going to set that up. Go ahead and get.
Awesome. Thank you all so much for having me. It was so grounding to hear from Mr. Lee about, the opportunities for holistic research and collaboration, and such an honor to share virtual space with Dr. Sumchai and hearing about the comprehensive work that Dr. Sumchai has led around environmental health testing and advancing environmental justice is just really inspiring. And I am going to maybe shift gears a little bit, and as Denise mentioned, speak more from the perspective of kind of federal funding opportunities from my angle as someone working for an advocacy organization, working toward a Green New Deal. So yeah, Denise, let me know when you're able to pull up the slides. I can still get us started without the slides though. Great. So as Denise mentioned earlier, thank you so much. You can go ahead to the next slide if you like. Denise mentioned earlier, my name is Priya Mulgaonkar. I use she, her pronouns. I work as a senior policy and field manager at the Green New Deal Network. We are a united front coalition of grassroots organizations, labor, climate and environmental justice organizations, growing a movement to pass policies at all levels of government to advance climate, jobs, and justice. So ensuring that we can tackle the intersecting crises of climate, the public health crises such as COVID that we're facing, longstanding racial and environmental injustices, while creating millions of good green jobs in the process and investing in frontline Black and Brown communities. Our network is anchored by a coordinating table of the 15 national organizations on our screen here. And we also partner with state climate coalitions in 24 different states to advance policies, again, at all levels of government. Next slide, please. So just a little bit of history about our coalition. So our formation came together really from the momentum of decades of climate and environmental justice organizing led by low-income communities of color. But more immediately, our specific coalition came together in the wake of the Sunrise Movement-led sit-ins with Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in Nancy Pelosi's office in 2019, which was the first kind of visible demonstration of support for the Green New Deal resolution, which was introduced soon after in 2019. So our network really formed as a means to bring together a united front of organizations from across the left to really ensure we have enough power to pass the kinds of transformational policies that we need and the types of bold federal investments in communities that have been long overdue to address the climate crisis. So our formation is really rooted in environmental justice leadership. Originally, when we formed, we were anchored by the Sunrise Movement, but after hearing concerns from allies in climate and environmental justice organizations, we kind of became anchored by the Working Families Party, who helped to convene our broad tent. And now our coalition has representatives from Grassroots Global Justice Alliance, the Climate Justice Alliance, Indigenous Environmental Network, who really bring the perspective of frontline communities to our table. So after our table formed, we were all hit by the COVID-19 crisis. Which really compounded existing environmental inequalities for folks who live in communities plagued by air pollution and other health challenges, disproportionately affecting communities of color. And soon after, the police murder of George Floyd led to mass uprisings against systemic racism in the United States. So in response to these intersecting crises, we wanted to create a bold, ambitious agenda to address these intersecting issues. So the result was our Thrive agenda, which was introduced in late 2020 as a clear, actionable blueprint to create millions of good-paying green jobs through building the kinds of infrastructure that we need to address the climate crisis and environmental justice, as well as providing much-needed care, while also investing specifically in Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities. So for those of you who tracked climate politics over the last few years, you might know that the Thrive agenda became kind of the foundation for Biden's Build Back Better agenda. In the meantime, we had initiatives such as the Justice 40 initiative, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. So we are starting to see, in 2021, major investments that were promised in the Biden administration's campaign to address the climate crisis. But we hit a roadblock with, unfortunately, the very entrenched influence of the fossil fuel industry in Congress, and specifically the notorious coal baron, Senator Joe Manchin from West Virginia, essentially blocked Build Back Better in late 2021. And sort of our current iteration of the Thrive agenda was really kind of whittled down, to be honest, into a much more modest climate and care package passed as the Inflation Reduction Act, which passed in August of 2022. And so now we're really moving into this crucial moment. We have, over $1 trillion on the table here. As I'll share in a later slide, not all of this money is earmarked for environmental justice, and some of the money is in fact earmarked to advance, further harms, bolstering the fossil fuel economy, putting forward false solutions that are in conflict with environmental justice. So we have a lot of work to do to make sure implementation is successful. Next slide, please. Great. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about GNDN's work with implementation, which has really kicked off this year. Next slide, please. So we've seen an unprecedented level of investment in climate jobs and environmental justice in the past few years. These investments also contain many gaps and additional harms. But we have still an opportunity to continue to advance our, collective shared vision for a Green New Deal. Next slide, please. And the reason our coalition is turning to implementation process is we really need to demonstrate that federal investments in our priorities can actually lead to material benefits for communities that have suffered at the hands of the extractive economy. So it's crucial to building resilience, wealth, and health, reducing emissions to hold off the worst of the climate crisis, creating millions of family-sustaining jobs, and also crucially to build more political momentum for even more ambitious and justice-rooted investments in the future. And finally, we really need to use these federal funds to show that community-led alternatives are both possible and necessary to stave off the worst of the climate crisis. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to dig in a little bit to the Inflation Reduction Act. So the IRA is, or IRA as some refer to it, is a historic investment in climate action, air quality, and environmental justice. It's expected to reduce U.S. greenhouse gas emissions by about 40% by 2030, if implemented well, which is a big if, while also supporting disadvantaged communities and clean energy. The investments from IRA are most significant in the energy sector, while also establishing groundwork for decarbonization in other sectors, including industry, buildings, agriculture, transportation, water supply, et cetera. And the bulk of this investment is in the form of tax credits for businesses, which is expected to spur kind of a green transition if, again, implemented well. And you'll see, I'll dive in a little bit later. The kind of grants portion of the legislation is a much smaller piece of the pie, but is also extremely crucial for environmental justice efforts. Next slide, please. So Mr. Lee might have covered most of this earlier, but I just wanted to show, just looking at one federal agency, the EPA in particular, the EPA alone will be administering over $40 billion in grant programs from IRA, covering a range of issues from community solar to reducing air pollution at ports to investing in clean heavy-duty vehicles. And it's also really exciting to have heard from Mr. Lee about the announcement of the Thriving Communities Technical Assistance Program. There are a lot of dollars that are going to be flowing, and it's really critical to ensure that environmental justice communities are able to access those opportunities. Next slide, please. I do also just want to name, from the Green New Deal Network's perspective, the many harms and gaps present in not only the Inflation Reduction Act, but also the bipartisan infrastructure law, which I won't be covering today for the sake of time. But we just want to name that both pieces of funding include a lot of incentives for harmful false solutions that may advance further air pollution in communities that have already been overburdened. There are many incentives to support the fossil fuel industry. There are explicit mandates for offshore leasing of oil and gas in Alaska and the Gulf South. So there are a lot of harms that were worked into this bill, as well as gaps that are missing from our original Thrive vision, and kind of a lack of guardrails to prevent funding for expanded fossil fuel infrastructure. And in particular, we had a lot of really ambitious health and care components to our vision that were not included in the final bill. I'm happy to share out a full analysis of the harms and gaps that we put together, but just wanted to highlight, we by no means see this as a perfect bill. Next slide, please. Great. So I want to dig in a little bit more into the environmental justice provisions of the Inflation Reduction Act. So this analysis is based off of the Just Solutions Collective, which is a really great group of experts who assess that of the over $370 billion of funding from IRA, only about $40 billion will actually be exclusively directed for environmental justice. This falls dramatically short of the Biden administration's Justice 40 initiative, which is a whole of government effort to aim for 40% of the benefits of spending on climate investments to go to disadvantaged communities. That being said, there are still billions of dollars on the table here. So I pulled this breakdown here. I'm happy to share out this report from Just Solutions Collective as well. But I'm going to dive in a little more in depth into a few pots of money that our organization is tracking for opportunities. Next slide, please. So the first pot is the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, which is one of the largest direct investments in IRA for environmental justice communities. So it's designed really to mobilize financial and technical assistance to reduce greenhouse gas and other air pollution while delivering the benefits for low income and disadvantaged communities. And one of the main mechanisms is really to kind of mobilize financing and private capital. So it's meant to be sort of an injection of public funds to spur further financial investment in solutions such as distributed clean energy and other forms of low emission technology. Just calling out here that of the $27 billion, there's a specific set aside for $7 billion for states, municipalities, tribal governments, and other eligible entities to support projects in low income and disadvantaged communities, as well as another $8 billion set aside for technical assistance for those same communities. So this is a huge opportunity to keep an eye out, especially for this funding is meant to go out in like larger grants. So these are going to be competitive grants. There's an estimate that there'll be about one for each state, even though these are competitive grants. That's sort of the way that I think EPA is planning to design the program. So it's really critical to track these funds to ensure that they're not being mobilized for false solutions, and that environmental justice communities can meaningfully participate in the implementation of the funds. And I know, I'm sorry, I'm at time. It's always hard for me to present all of this information in a short amount of time. So I will try to zip through the next few pots of money. We can go to the next slide. So for the environmental and climate justice block grants, which will be administered by EPA, these are grants that directly invest in community projects in disadvantaged communities. I wanted to call to the attention that the eligible projects include community-led air and other pollution monitoring, prevention and remediation, as well as mitigating climate and health risks, and reducing indoor toxics and indoor air pollution. So really crucial opportunity here. Mr. Lee had actually mentioned earlier that the first $100 million from this pot of money is currently available. And in fact, the deadline to apply is today for two kind of smaller pots of money. One is an environmental justice problem solving grant that goes directly for nonprofit organizations, as well as the government to government grant, where local or state governments apply in partnership with local groups. The remaining funds are still kind of TBD in terms of timeline, so we're tracking that very closely. But the broader kind of eligibility requirements is quite expansive. It includes nonprofit organizations, academic institutions, states, tribes, municipalities. So while this is a fairly small pot of money, if you think at the national scale, there's still opportunity to seed environmental justice projects in frontline communities. Next slide, please. I'll just touch on the Neighborhood Access and Equity Grant Program very briefly, but these are competitive grants to kind of restore communities that have been disrupted by harmful highway infrastructure to improve walkability, safety, and affordable transportation. Similarly to the climate justice block grants, there's a range of eligible entities. We are still tracking the timeline for these grants. So, keep an eye out for these. This is similarly a really great opportunity for folks who are advancing projects such as fence line air monitoring, air quality monitoring, and methane monitoring. Next slide, please. So I want to touch briefly on one last bucket of money that is not exclusively for environmental justice communities, but is still pretty consequential. So the climate pollution reduction grants comprises of funding to help government entities to implement and actually develop and then implement their greenhouse gas reduction plans. So again, these are government entities that are eligible. The first kind of non-competitive planning grants, the deadline was actually, I think, 1 or 2 weeks back, but there's up to $3 million for each state available and up to $1 million for major cities. I actually believe the applications for cities to indicate their interest for these non-competitive planning grants is not until April 26th. So there's still some time for cities to apply. The EPA has a tracker, which I can link in a moment, of which states and cities have applied. Sadly, there are 4 states that did not put a bid in for these funds, which means they are then ineligible to apply for the remaining $4.6 billion in competitive grants. But this is really crucial for our environmental justice communities and organizations to track, because these states are going to be either developing or potentially improving upon existing greenhouse gas reduction plans. And there's real opportunity to bring in tracking and addressing of co-pollutants that cause environmental harms, for cumulative impacts, to ensure that any mitigation efforts don't disproportionately burden environmental justice communities or leave communities behind in the process. Yes, another one to keep an eye out for. Yes, I'll definitely share out this presentation with folks as well as some resources. I'm seeing David's comment in the chat. Great. So just to wrap up, I'll share just a couple more slides. Just for more grounding in Green New Deal network strategy moving forward. So we are really trying to determine how we can build capacity for environmental justice communities to access the benefits and minimize the harms of these federal funds, while also building political power at the local and state level. And some of the ways that we're doing that are on the next slide. So our one of our strategies this year is to really build capacity for our state coalitions in particular, each of which, similar to our national formation, has environmental justice groups at their tables. So we're providing fact sheets, guides, and explainers. We are responding to public comment and RFIs where applicable. We recently responded to an RFI from the EPA about their environmental justice and climate justice block grants, offering ways to make the application process less burdensome for small environmental justice organizations, in partnership with a lot of other national groups that are advocating the same thing. We're supporting states in their campaign development. So, how can we, while organizing our bases in our communities, advocate for more federal investment and also ensure that the federal dollars are going to the right projects? And then we're also helping our states craft their narrative to really, show that federal investment in climate justice can provide material benefits for folks. I don't know about you all, but I think the Inflation Reduction Act had a bit of a branding problem and is not a super accessible piece of information. Right now, the Biden administration is doing a national tour to sort of highlight the opportunities here. But I think realizing the benefits of this investment is going to take a lot of effort and a lot of storytelling and communication with day-to-day folks who aren't plugged into the national climate politics. And then I'll just wrap up to share the next slide, which just includes links to more resources that we've developed, some workshops that we've held. Again, I'll share out these slides so you can access these links. And then on the last slide is just my email address. I can also drop that in the chat box if you have any further questions about anything I shared today or suggestions or intel. There's a lot to track with implementation work. Our team is fairly small at the Green New Deal Network. We definitely rely on other folks who are tracking these things to share and collaborate.